James Shaw, thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Just a little bit about your background. I was surprised to learn you joined the Green Party when you were 16.
That's right, just up the road from here at Wellington High School. It was 1990, which of course was a pretty watershed election as well. And there was a debate in the Wellington High School library with a Labour candidate, a National candidate and a Green Party candidate. And the Labour and National candidates spent their whole time kind of bickering with each other and talking about, I don't know, interest rates and things which didn't have a whole lot of relevance. And the Green Party candidate talked about things that I thought were important, like how we're going to live together on the face of this planet. And so I went up to him at the end and I said, how can I help? And if you ever say that in the vicinity of a Green Party candidate, one day you end up as leader of the Green Party. So that was that.
So you went, as a 20-year-old, in your mid-20s, you went to London and you joined Price Waterhouse as an intern. That's an odd thing for a green person to do.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I'd been working with an international student exchange organisation based in Brussels, and they organised internships all over the world. And they had a real focus on what was at that point called corporate social responsibility. And so I'd sort of had some background in that field, and then that was some of the work that I ended up doing at Price Waterhouse. And that then turned into a real job. So initially it was supposed to be a sort of 12 to 18 month gig. But they offered me a role, and then I ended up working in the chairman's office on corporate values and sustainable development and what's our strategy in that sort of area. So that was really the start of this whole career.
Then you started your own business.
Yeah, that's right. In a poorly timed choice, I walked out of PwC in 2001 just before the dot-com crash and decided to set up as a freelancer. So I didn't eat for about 4 or 5 years after that, but I set up an organisation called Future Considerations Limited with some colleagues of mine, and that's still going strong today.
And then you decided to come back to New Zealand and get into politics.
Yeah, so I did. In the early 2000s, I did a master's degree at Bath University in sustainable development and business leadership. And I think the realisation I had while I was there was, and this had probably always been there and I hadn't really admitted to it, is that although we were doing some really good work in the private sector, helping businesses to have less of an environmental impact and think more about their social impact and so on, that the scale of change was really slow. And actually even some of the biggest companies in the world were actually struggling to justify investing in sustainable development initiatives because they were in a competitive environment with companies that weren't. And so I thought, well, actually, if we really want things to change at the speed and the scale in which they've got to change, then that's the domain of politics.
So let's talk about economics for a moment. You want a fairer society?
Yes.
So you sat down with Grant Robertson, who might be our next Minister of Finance, who knows?
I think he will.
And you worked out a memorandum of understanding, but also a fiscal responsibility policy.
Yeah. Did
you both agree about what the relationship of government should be to the marketplace?
Well, did we have? I'm not sure that we had that discussion explicitly, but if you've read what's in that package, there's a number of things which I guess imply an understanding of what we would describe as a mixed economy, where the government has a leadership role, but not a dominant role necessarily.
Right, so you're largely pro-market. Allow the market to do pretty much what it can do.
Well, no. So I believe in a well-regulated market, and at the moment we don't have one.
Well, how much regulation are we talking about, and what kind of regulation?
It depends on the sector that you're in, right? And also, I think there is a number of ways to change things, right? One of which is regulation, another of which is investment, and to think about what are the incentives. So I'll give you agriculture as a really good example, right? So at the moment we've got a situation where you've got tremendous emissions into the atmosphere and from the ruminant animals on the land, and also into the soil and into the water. It's a leading cause of pollution in our rivers. And so then there are a mix of things that you can do, some of which is around regulation. So, for example, requiring farmers to do fencing and riparian planting and so on and so forth. There are also incentives that you can offer, right? So at the moment, many of our dairy farmers are deeply in debt. The Reserve Bank describes this as the second greatest threat to our economy after the housing debt. And that is because farmers borrowed up the wazoo in order to invest in intensive dairying. Then the price fell out, so most of them are underwater to start with. So saying to them, well, we now want you to get out of that business and into something else, whether it's organic dairying or other forms of land use, is simply not practicable. So what the question is, well, then how do we help them transition from where they are now to where we want them to be in the future? And you've got to align those economic incentives, because if the regulation's pulling in one direction but the economic incentives are pulling in another, then you're never going to solve the problem. You've got to get those things aligned.
Okay, well, you mentioned housing, and you've got an interesting housing policy. I mean, I don't know whether this will come as a surprise to you, but I'm older than you.
No, really?
And I came from a generation, I grew up in socialist New Zealand, where my parents got a 3% loan, 5% deposit, 3% loan for 40 years. And I read some recognisable material in your housing policy, a rent-to-own type of policy. But this takes us to the issue of banking, because in my parents' time, the only bank in town really was the post office, and the trading banks really, weren't that powerful. With deregulation of the banks, you then get the situation where you've got all of this foreign money coming into New Zealand, they've got access to it, and the mortgage market is largely put in the hands of the trading banks. Deregulation of the banks wasn't a wonderful thing. What are you going to do about that? You want to use Kiwi Bank, but in some sort of competitive way. How's that going to work? What regulation are you going to put on trading banks who, let's face it, make money every time they rack up a debt?
Yeah. Well, they literally do. That's how money gets created in the banking system. I mean, so I was really disappointed at what the government did by moving Kiwi Bank into the ownership of the superannuation fund, because what happens there is that the super fund, its job is to make sure that there's a sufficient pot of money for all of the baby boomers to retire over the course of the next few decades. And so it's required to, and I want it to, maximise its return on investment, right? Otherwise, it's not going to be able to do that job. So if you think about what they're going to do with Kiwi Bank, they got given it for half price to start with, right? So they already got a 50% discount. Then they're going to invest in it and grow it and so on and so forth. So then after 5 years, when the period of the time limit comes off, when they can then say, well, actually we're allowed to move it on, they can decide to hold on to it, or they can sell it. Now they have to offer it back to the government first, but by then it will be worth at least 4 times what they bought it for. And I think any finance minister, whether it's Grant Roberts or not, will look at the price tag and find that just a bit too eye-watering, at which point they can move it off into the private market. And so then, unfortunately, it will be gone. And I think Kiwi Bank is a really strategic asset. When the GFC hit, it kept lending into the New Zealand market and then making sure that small businesses were able to get access to credit, while all the big Aussie banks were withdrawing and retrenching all of their capital back to Australia. And so there's a huge risk to the economy there of not having a publicly owned bank that can continue to do that.
That sounds like nationalisation. Would you nationalise some things?
No. I think, what I'm interested in doing is to explore how we can retain ownership of Kiwi Bank as a strategic asset. I mean, that is the really important thing, I think. It does have some other really good public uses, like it does, because it is competitive and because profit isn't the single most important thing to it, that it does actually keep the big Aussie banks honest and ensuring that they, that they're, whether it's interest rates or fees or kind of other finance costs, do get passed on to onto Kiwis.
I'm on the same page as you in terms of we have to have a smarter economy. We have to think better, and we have to have sustainable types of approaches to things. What surprises me about your housing policy is it isn't very innovative. I mean, when I look at things like in Germany, for example, you have long-term leasing from large institutions. Have you considered things like using the superannuation fund and the ACC and saying to them, well, okay, you have to invest so much in housing which is on long-term lease, because I wonder whether we're getting locked into this idea that ownership is the only way to get security of tenure. What kids need is security of tenure. They need to be able to go to the same school. John Key was lucky enough to get that. We provided state houses. We gave them security of tenure. You could keep going to the same school. You could be in a community. How can we give people security of tenure?
Well, some of it you simply regulate. Talking about smart regulation. I mean, one of the reasons why so many Kiwis want to own their own home is because renting is so insecure. And actually, if you had security of tenure, then people would feel that they didn't need to invest all of their spare capital into a house, which is also not terribly secure because it binds you into massive mortgage payments and a debt cycle. So we have said that we want to ensure that people do have security of tenure with a standard 3-year lease, which by agreement of both parties can be shorter, but that the standard lease is for 3 years. That rental properties have a warrant of fitness so that they don't kill people, because at the moment you've got 40,000 visits to the hospital by kids, and 1,600 people die every winter that don't die in the other months. And so warrant of fitness, security of tenure, limiting rent rises to once a year, because at the moment landlords are able to put up the rent multiple times each year. And so on. And so if you do those kinds of things, then people won't necessarily feel that they actually have to go out and get into what is currently a speculative property bubble.
Fairer society. We don't have a very fair education system. We have a public system of rich and poor schools.
Yes.
And that determines a lot the outcome of kids who go to school in poor areas. What are you going to do about that?
So my colleague Catherine Delahunt has done a lot of work on this over the years, and one of the things that we've been talking about recently is actually access. I mean, the first principle, of course, is that you need a good school in every neighbourhood, and this idea, and you need to invest in that, right? And the idea that people should be freed up to go to the good schools, essentially is throwing up your hands in defeat and saying, oh well, that means that poor schools by definition have to be bad schools. So I think we really have to that's your first principle.
At the core of that, though, is the way that we administer schools.
Yeah.
The tomorrow schools principle, that you can, local communities can have their people. So all the accountants and the lawyers have great schools, and the people who have to work on the roads and fix cars and things like that don't have quite so great schools. What are we going to do about administering?
Although it's funny because, I was actually the first student representative on the Wellington High School Board of Trustees back in 1987, 88, whenever that was, when it was first introduced. And that whole idea of community involvement and the boards of trustees and so on has actually been wound back to a huge degree over the course of the last several decades. So obviously boards of trustees still exist, but not the kind of powers that they have and the independence of schools.
What's happened is the ministry has taken over and gone, this isn't working. The worst thing, people are actually trying to run their own schools and have their own programs. What a terrible thing. The problem is that wasn't bought into by everybody. It has happened by not osmosis, but by shrinking the process. No one bought into this idea that the ministry would dictate everything.
No, that's right.
So what are we going to do about that?
Well, I think if you look at the way, the relationship between the ministry and schools isn't the healthiest, and actually it kind of never has been. But it passes through different phases depending on the minister and what the current trend is and so on. So I do have some sympathy that really needs to be overhauled.
See, I was a teacher in the days when, in fact, education wasn't governed by politicians. We had a Director General of Education who was there regardless of what the current political politicians of the day were. And when you look at education systems like in Finland, and in Sweden, you see that. You see a depoliticised system. Would you be for depoliticising the education system?
Well, I'm for depoliticising a lot of things. I think if you look at Finland and Sweden and the other Northern European countries, actually their whole model of governance, whether it's education right across the board, that they've actually worked out how to have really good long-term public services where, obviously there is a level of democratic oversight and input, but you don't get the kinds of big swings in policy that we do here. Denmark, for example, has got a tax plan that takes it through to about the year 2050, where they're looking at what is the shift in the economy over the coming decades and how do you change that. And there's quite a high level of buy-in. And obviously as the government changes, through elections, there's a little bit of tweaking and mid-course correction, but for the most part, they've got buy-in across the spectrum. And I actually think that we need to, if I can elevate your question out of education, just say we need to look at New Zealand's whole system of governance. That's one of the things that brought me to the Green Party in the first place, because I don't think that the punch and judy show and the adversarial system that we've got is terribly effective.
Charter schools.
So, well, we agree with Labour's policy that those schools that currently exist, that we would bring into the public system in the form of special character schools, but that the idea of charter schools, that they don't have to deliver the New Zealand curriculum, they don't have to answer to OIA requests, and that they get different levels of funding per student from a regular public school, that'll be history.
Where are you on things like national standards and testing kids?
Well, we don't like national standards. We've said that we want to move past that pretty quickly. And also the idea that kids get tested at such an early age means that they're getting taught to the test the whole time through. So we think, if you look at evidence around the world, again in Northern Europe, they've got much more functional education systems that are much less heavily reliant on testing. But I think there's a job here for government in actually educating the public about what works and what doesn't work. Because we do have particularly Victorian, early industrial era notions of how education needs to work here. And of course, we're living in the 21st century and we're past the Industrial Revolution. And we need to be preparing kids for the 21st century, not the 20th.
Oral language, for example. What we're doing now, the number of people who make their living out of talking, out of, from broadcasting to sales to what we're doing right now, and yet we don't test oral language.
No, we don't.
Yeah. And yes, it's one of the most valuable things in life.
It is, yeah. I personally, as someone who is and has been in the position of being an employer, I've been pretty stunned at the poor quality of even, kids from, pretty good backgrounds, good schooling, and so on. That their kind of basic level there isn't as strong as it used to be.
I visited a school in Metiria, which I filmed, which uses the discovery approach to learning. And it says, you're trying to light curiosity in children. And that you can, you learn, as we all do, by our mistakes, and we get punished in the Victorian system. You've got to get it right, you're not allowed to get it wrong. Well, actually, often in life, we get things wrong and then we learn from that, but we can't test that easily. We can't test your ability to cooperate and work with others, and you're going to need that in the 21st.
You are, and I think anybody in business would tell you that the ability the willingness to fail is a critical mindset, and then the ability to learn from that failure and to get back on your feet after it.
And how to deal with that failure.
That's absolutely, that's utterly critical. And what holds a lot of people back, in their careers is a fear of failure. And and you're absolutely right. That's definitely something that we need to instill in our young people.
You are the leader of the Green Party. You were the co-leader.
And will be again.
And will be again. It was one of the questions I had. It's just a temporary position.
It is,
at the moment.
Yeah. A temporary condition.
Right. We're talking about ethics and talking about morality and things like that. I guess one of the brands that the Greens had that people thought about was they thought, well, at least they're the ethical guys. They're the guys, they're the Jiminy Crickets in government who say, well, just hang on for a minute, And you've had what must be a terrible time dealing with a situation ethic. Some people have got black and white rules, these are the rules to live by and these are the rules that, this is the bad things, these are the good things. But often in life, things aren't that clear. As I understand it, Metiria sent you an email with her speech, and you wrote back to her what? What did you say when you first saw that speech that she was going to give?
I sent her an email and I said, that's a good speech.
You didn't think to say, take 2 aspirins and call me in the morning?
No, I didn't. And I think, a couple of things about that. First of all, as I've said a number of times, I'm not a parent and I'm pretty well off. I've never been in the situation that Metiria has been in, of being a solo parent with a young child living below the poverty line on income support. And I find it hard to judge somebody who is in that situation because, as you say, life is black and white. So somebody said to me the other day, do I condone benefit fraud? I said, no, of course not. But do I condone withholding food from my baby? No, I don't condone that either. Met's speech, when I read it, was like, this is a pretty powerful illustration of the very bad choices that honest people are in. And I find it hard to judge them for that.
So then I went to a number of strategists who talked about it. And you all collectively decided, did you, that it was all right you probably were in the position of going, I don't know whether we can give this woman permission or not. It's a matter for her. I mean, what did you decide? How did that go?
No, we did have a discussion about it, a round of discussions, and collectively came to the decision that it was worth the risk. Yeah. And we knew it was a big risk. She knew it was a big risk. I mean, she did actually explicitly say, this could end in my resignation. And we said, well, do you think that is worth it? And she said, yes, I do. And so we said, okay.
When I do difficult topics and I tell people stories, and when they come to me with a story or they agree to take part in my documentary, one of the things I say to them is, have you thought about how this will be for your family and for those around you? And that, did anybody say to Metiria, how's this going to be for your daughter, for your family? I mean...
So, well, look, I wasn't involved in all of the discussions with all of the people, right? So I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but I do know that they did go through, all of those circumstances, and that people did say, that this will, there'll be a tremendous spotlight on you. And, you can argue that we were being naive, but, again, Metiria herself said, no, I think it's worth the risk. You've got to remember that 6 weeks ago, the whole country was basically sleepwalking into this election.
Absolutely.
The outcome was predetermined. It was simply whether or not, Bill was also going to need Winston in order to form a government. And, we really felt that after 15 years of trying to get poverty on the agenda in New Zealand, Met herself had said she'd tried everything else, members' bills, campaigns, whatever have you, and this was really the last thing that she could think of to try and really, create that initiative.
And did anybody else say, is there anything else, Metiria, that we need to know?
Yes.
So you knew it all?
Yes. Well, and to the extent that she did. Yeah.
Okay. Very quickly, if you want a fairer society, you're going to have to tax some people. Mm-hmm. What's your tax plan? Are you going to be taxing people on high incomes or people with high wealth? How are you going to bring in a tax regime?
There's a couple of things. So I think one of the things that people get confused about in New Zealand is the distinction between wealth and income. And we do have income inequality in New Zealand, but the real driver of inequality is wealth inequality, which is primarily driven through the housing bubble. And so in order to address wealth inequality, the first step on that is a proper comprehensive capital gains tax, which we have been advocating for the entire time that we've been in Parliament. We did a count this morning. We've done 94 press releases on it over time. So, we've been pretty consistent about that. And I'm in favour of the capital gains tax, not just to try and redress the imbalance in the property market, but to get people thinking about where they invest their money. Should it be in the speculative property bubble or should it be in the productive part of the economy? And on the other side, we have said that we want to reintroduce a more progressive income tax policy. So what we've said is that people earning $150,000 and above will pay an additional 7 cents in the dollar. So that top tax rate will then be 40%. And the bottom threshold, the first $14,000 that everybody earns, the tax rate will actually drop from 10.5% to 9%. And so what that does is it introduces a great deal more progressivity into the tax system.
I'll tell you something I do like, is the transparency that you have said, if you vote for us, we'll be with Labour and that will be your government. I do have a problem with the Winston thing, as we'll wait and see and after the election, because that's a vote for uncertainty. We don't know what kind of government we're going to have. But a few weeks ago, maybe going back a couple of months ago, when things weren't so rosy, The relationship between Labour and Greens, if I can put it this way, was kind of symbiotic.
Mm-hmm.
Now it seems to become parasitic. You know, they seem to be sucking the policy life out of you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a problem for you?
Well, yes and no. So yes, in the sense that, you know, we have to really strongly make the case about why it is that the Greens not only need to be in government, but need to be a significant part of that government. But no, in the sense that what that means is that coalition between Labour and the Greens will be highly aligned on the policy program. So what that means is a really stable coalition, a stable core coalition of Labour and the Greens. And yes, there may be other parties involved, but it means that there's a high level of agreement to start with. The case that I'm making that we need to be a large part of that coalition comes down to a few things, one of which is we need to be as large as possible so that Winston doesn't have Labour over a barrel, right? So if you want a really progressive Labour-led government, it's got to be the Greens rather than New Zealand First, who are the primary coalition partner in that, right? That's really significant. Because a Labour New Zealand First coalition will not be a progressive government.
What about a New Zealand First national government?
Well, that would be even less progressive, wouldn't it? So,
which we could get.
Yes, we could easily get. And this is my case, is that only the Green Party and the Labour Party have guaranteed that we will change the government. New Zealand First hasn't guaranteed that. So that is why I'm asking people to give their party vote to the Green Party, because Labour needs us in order to form a coalition, and they need us to be fairly large in order to make up the numbers to get over the line. So that's one reason. The other reason is that if you look at those kind of core issues that we're campaigning on and that Labour have recently been making a lot of noise about, climate change, cleaning up our rivers and ending poverty in New Zealand, I think that you will find that in the 17 years that we've been in Parliament, we have been absolutely consistently leading on all three of those things, while other political parties, the Labour Party as well, have come and gone on those issues. So if you want those three things to be at the top of the political agenda, then we need to be a pretty influential part of that government. Otherwise, there is every chance that those three things will fall by the wayside while we're getting to all of the other stuff, and will it ever be a priority, and will it get watered down and so on. So that's why we're there.
James Shaw, thanks for talking with me.
Thanks for having me on the show.